welcome to this virtual edition of Theorizing at Rowan. For those who don't know me, my name is Ed Kazarian. I am the coordinator of Theorizing at Rowan, and I also teach in the Philosophy and World Religions department here at Rowan. And we've been doing this as I'm slightly tooting my own horn, but I'm glad to say we've been doing this for 10 years as of this semester. So we're very excited to have been able to do it for so long, and we're excited to continue doing it in the future, and we're very excited to have tonight's event. Now, I would like to introduce our event and our speaker. And the first thing I need to sort of mention is that today's event, the whole series, but today's event especially, is also co-sponsored by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, which provides us with a great deal of generous technical and financial support. And without them, we would not have been able to do this for all this time. And this particular event is also co-sponsored by the Catalyst Project, the Professor of the Future. And we're super excited to have their support as well. And hopefully some people involved in that project are among the many of you who've shown up for to hear. Now, let me introduce our speaker and the talk. Dr. Ash Lierman is the Instruction and Education Librarian at Campbell Library here at Rowan University, as well as the chair of the Rowan University's Libraries DEI Committee. They support research and instruction across Rowan, particularly for the College of Education, graduate students, and online learners. I have personally benefited from their gracious help in helping some of my students work on research projects, and it is tremendously useful. Their research and professional service interests focus on social justice for marginalized academic library users and workers, especially those who are disabled and LGBTQ+. Today, Dr. Lierman is going to give us a presentation called "The Struggle You Can't See: Higher Education Experiences of Invisibly Disabled and Neurodivergent Students." And if you will give me literally 2 seconds to kind of switch the pin, I'd like to ask you all to join me in welcoming Dr. Ash Lierman.
All right. Thank you so much, Ed. And yes, as mentioned, this is a little bit more toward the practical social sciences end of chess. So I really appreciate the invitation to have me here with you all tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with the presentation. So as previously introduced, the presentation is "The Struggle You Can't See: Higher Education Experiences of Invisibly Disabled and Neurodivergent Students." And this is coming specifically out of some literature review research that I've been engaged in over the past couple of years, and that may be at this point approaching something like a book. So I'm excited to share this with you all. So what we're going to be doing with the talk tonight, just to outline what this is going to look like, I'm going to give you a little bit of context on what sort of environment this all enters into in higher education. And I'm going to talk about the research that I've done on that, including some of the scope information about what I'm doing and what I'm not doing with that. For the most part, the body of this presentation will be concerned with looking at highlights from what I've found out. So the real meat of things, what those experiences have been that students have, and what we can kind of take away from that. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about, of course, what can we do about this, regardless of who we may be in higher education, and what are sort of the next steps in the short and long term in the future. So to give us a bit of context, college is fundamentally a hostile environment to disabled and neurodivergent people. I say that with absolute confidence. For one thing, it has only been about 30 to 40 years since legislation has been introduced that has meant that colleges just cannot simply say no thank you if a disabled student applies. That is, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act and some prior legislation of that as well regarding education. But these things are still in relatively recent memory. And I think more importantly, the enforcement of that legislation, this short distance onward is still kind of a work in progress. It has always been really a challenge. And some of the teeth have kind of been taken out of that legislation as well in litigation afterwards, that what that actually means that universities have to provide to make college accessible to their students has been minimized in a lot of ways. So one thing that means is that there hasn't really been any standardization across institutions in terms of what it means that you have to admit and support disabled students. So the way that tends to look in practice is that support for disabled students attending higher education institutions, it tends to be a bit sporadic, spread out. There are pockets of people who are sympathetic and who really try to go out of their way to help students, but there's not necessarily a lot of uniformity in terms of where and how and when students actually get support. And I'm going to make some broad sweeping statements that I'm not going to back up because we don't have time for that right now. But there are a lot of prevailing attitudes in higher education of hierarchical attitudes. Some people have authority over others, and there's a very top-down system of power structures. There are a lot of carceral attitudes in higher education, and by that I mean punitive and regarding students as potential offenders who are uh, out to put something over on faculty. There are adversarial relationships between those where students are not trusted as collaborators in their own education a lot of the time. And this comes in turn with a lot of neoliberal attitudes that we see at work generally in our culture and that have worked on higher education in a number of ways. When I say neoliberal, I'm talking about the increasing tendency in the political arena to uh, view individualism and individual gain and capitalistic gain as paramount, and the concept of things that are a public good and to serve the larger community as a whole are less valued than they have been in previous years and generations. So that has impacted higher education from without in terms of the kind of support and funding that it gets, and from within in the ways that people pick up and start to espouse those attitudes within institutions. There can also be a real stigma in higher education and in academia of students and other members of the community with impairments of mind, in particular, with cognitive and psychological impairments, because so much of academia does focus on the work of the mind, and there's an automatic sort of knee-jerk response that to think that those who think differently or think with some challenges don't belong there. So these are all of the kind of the things that students are facing when they come into a higher education situation and are disabled. So my research was very cognizant of this context, and also of my role as a librarian. I came into this really thinking about, particularly as a librarian serving a college of education, what could I do to support education students and pre-service teachers in particular? And one of the things that I really ran across looking at the literature there is that in terms of marginalized students, there are a lot of ways that you can cross-cut this, but one particular group that tends to struggle, particularly in education preparation, is really students with learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, other things, again, affecting that domain of the mind. And so that seemed like a good place for me to start. And also, obviously, this is one of my research interests, particularly as I am myself an invisibly disabled person. I have chronic disabling mental and physical illnesses. So this was kind of my home territory, and also an opportunity for me to reach out to people who may be going through some of the same experiences that I have gone through, being a person who's gone through academia as a student and as a staff and faculty member. So what I did, and this comes very much out of my role as librarian, was to go to the literature and conduct basically a meta review of qualitative studies, and particularly interview and focus group studies. What I really wanted to hear was the voices of students as much as possible as they have been funneled through scholars and literature to date, and talking about just their experiences broadly with higher education. So I didn't really want to be led by anything. I wanted to just look at the broad picture of what students encounter when they come to school, and what that might lead me toward in terms of maybe some really creative and different things that libraries could do to support those needs. So there's a particular set of categories that really emerged for me that I was looking at here, which is autistic students, dyslexic students, and those with related conditions, which I defined as things like dyscalculia, dyspraxia, which aren't necessarily the same as dyslexia, but tend to, unfortunately, the reality of the thing is they tend to be less studied and to be kind of slotted together. So I sort of rolled that up into its own imperfect category. Students with ADHD, students with what I'm calling psychiatric disabilities, mental illness, and things like mental illness and related to it, students with traumatic brain injuries, and chronically ill students. So, chronically ill almost feels like the odd category out here. And I want to call that out really quickly because pretty much all the rest of these in some way affect the cognitive or behavioral or emotional domains. And chronic illness is really the only one that's focused on physical elements. And initially, I really just included that category as a matter of personal interest because that is the experience that I'm coming out of. But what I actually discovered as I looked at all of these things together is that there's such significant overlap between chronic illness and the other conditions here, and so many similarities in the patterns of the types of experiences that students tend to have that it really belongs here. And this also is not comprehensively all invisible disabilities. I understand that things like visual and auditory and mobility disabilities can all take invisible forms, but these tend to be ones that fit into that same category where people's experiences can't really be quantified from without, at least by a casual observer, and where as a result, that invisibility and that sense of doubt and skepticism from others actually compounds the difficulties that they go through. So they all sort of have that in common as students move forward. So I've settled on this term of neurodivergent and invisibly disabled students, which is clunky, but I feel like it's the most precise that I can kind of be because those two things are sometimes the same. They're sometimes the same in the same person, and they're sometimes not. Not obviously not all invisibly disabled students are neurodivergent. Also, not all neurodivergent students are necessarily disabled. And there's quite a bit of overlap and ambiguity and border crossing between those conditions, as well as a tremendous likelihood that if a student has one, they have more than one, particularly when it comes to psychiatric disabilities, depression and anxiety, particularly, depending on how you're defining that, but those tend to really be common conditions that also occur either as a result of the struggles that students are going through with other conditions or just alongside them. So these are all categories of student who are disabled in ways that share similar patterns and similar needs. And also just to acknowledge that it's a lot more complicated than this, than I can necessarily go into here. But this general Venn diagram of neurodivergence and invisible disability is really where this research is focused. So let's move into what I've found out from looking at this information. So the challenges that I've found that students really run into fall into a couple different categories. And I'm sort of broadly composing this together as college and campus challenges. So this is overall big picture things that students face. And I would say at the top of this list, number one, what I saw over and over and over again throughout students' experiences in literature is that there is too much demand on their time and their effort. Disproportionate, outsized demands for effort by these students. And that happens for a couple different reasons. One of which is that many of these conditions tend to incur information processing and communication challenges for students. So it takes longer and it takes more effort to read, to write, to talk to people, to participate in conversations, all of the things that students have to do over and over again in a majority of college classes. So that's putting them at a time and effort disadvantage. These conditions also share in common that they tend to have a very cyclical and unpredictable nature as well, that you may be fine one day and you may not be able to get out of bed the next. And those are things that interfere with how you do your classwork and create additional delays and missed deadlines and other things that impair the ability to keep up with classes. And of course, that they all tend very often to be linked to mental health challenges. So that it has a cost to concentration, there's distraction and just mental processing load that dealing with mental health symptoms really adds to someone. It creates sleep difficulties, it can create physical health difficulties. So those challenges are also introduced as well. So you have students in all of these different groupings who are spending by an order of magnitude more time than their peers to do the same amount of work. And it impacts their quality of life very negatively. Story after story of students who completely eliminated socializing and extracurriculars and spending time with their friends and family in order just to get their academic work done. And it is also inequitable. It is creating an experience where some students are being asked to fulfill a burden of work that just isn't commensurate with what we expect from others. So that really colors all of the other experiences that students are going through, because everything that they might have to respond to that comes up in their lives, they have to think about, well, I'm already short of time. This doing these readings is going to take me 16 hours when it should be taking me 3, whatever that may look like. Similarly, there's also the fact that the inequity that students face in higher education starts from the most basic choices they make: where to go to school, what to major in, what program to be in, what classes to take. All of these things are influenced to an outsized degree by what they need to be able to navigate that experience, rather than their academic interests, and even rather than what they're capable of in terms of their academic work. Uh, there's also uh, the issue of disability identity, identifying as disabled and being able to incorporate that into your image of self. That has been shown in literature to buffer a lot of factors that students with disabilities go through. It also tends to be relatively very weak for students in these kinds of categories that I'm looking at. There's much more of a likelihood to not identify as disabled, or to not identify as disabled enough, whatever that means, and to think that students don't deserve the accommodations or the sense of pride in disability that other students might be able to find. And on a similar note to that, this is a group of disabled students who are particularly unlikely to use accommodations and support. They're uh, for any number of tiered reasons. They don't know that they have a condition. They're very likely to be diagnosed late in life, maybe in college, maybe not at all until after college, maybe never. Um, and we all, as I always think about this, we're all born with one body and one mind, and we don't know what our experience is like compared to anyone else's, especially when it's something like being disabled, which is stigmatized and where often we are disconnected from one another. We don't get a chance to really discuss and compare our experiences between other people who are disabled and other people who are not disabled or neurotypical. So there's a lack of the sense that they need something, or if they do know, they may not be able to get a formal diagnosis. That has a cost in terms of finances and time to actually go through the medical procedures to be diagnosed with something. And these conditions can present in such a wide variety of ways that that diagnosis might be withheld for reasons that aren't actually valid. Or if they do have a diagnosis, they don't ask for support, or they do ask for support and it is not fully delivered, or it fails at the level of the individual professor who says, well, I don't believe that ADHD is a real thing, so I'm not going to do that, which they pretty much get away with, and mostly because of misinterpretations of what academic freedom means. Or even if the accommodations are fully implemented, it still might not be hitting what the student actually needs. So this is such a set of hurdles to jump through before you get to anything that often, it fails halfway through. And it's extra time and effort that the student has to be exerting that we already know that they're very short on to begin with. And a lot of what goes into being successful at this is self-advocacy, right? We expect students to bring their own accommodations to faculty and negotiate with them because they're adults now and they should be doing this for themselves. But they've never been taught to do so. And they, at least not in any formalized, uniform way. Some students have parents who coached and engaged with them on how to advocate for their own needs, and they tend to be much more successful. Students who don't have those skills already, or who don't feel comfortable making the social connections and communication leaps to negotiate those things with other people, are much less likely to get through it successfully. And over time, we see that those skills do develop, but they've got to have time. They've got to be able to make it through their programs long enough to actually build that confidence and be able to advocate for themselves. So in terms of the actual curriculum, once we get inside the classroom as well, there's a big grouping of challenges here. So I will say that the biggest challenge that students face and the most helpful support that students can have are both faculty. When a lot of the time when students disclose or ask for accommodations with faculty or work with them, many reports in their experiences of just overwhelmingly negative experiences with that, often to the point of being discriminatory, abusive, triggering mental health symptoms, and complete academic avoidance because they have had such a traumatic experience with a faculty member reacting to them negatively. On the other hand, when faculty are supportive, those are consistently some of the most transformative experiences that a student can have. It single-handedly can be an enabler of academic success. So whether faculty are supportive or not, in terms of disabled students, is absolutely a make or break proposition. It's one of the most important things that can happen. In terms of how the course is actually taught, too, strong, clear course structure, flexibility, and allowing a student some degree of control over how they learn and how they express that learning. These are going to sound really familiar if you're familiar with the principles of universal design for learning, right? But those are the critical things that kind of emerge out of students' experiences. That it isn't necessarily that any one type of teaching is more suitable to students' needs. It's that they need to understand how the course is set up, they need it to be able to flex a little bit for them, and they need to have some degree of control over it. And similar to that is the need for lecture material outside of class. That's kind of into the weeds even a little bit, but just one of the things that comes up the most often as being as important is having access to notes, lecture recordings, any kinds of things that they can refer back to and reuse later. And that is also one of the things that tends to get most frequently denied because of this perception that it is somehow unfair to have access to that, or that it's an undue burden for the faculty member. So there's some particular issues with that as well. Another thing that tends to be challenging is traditional lecture formats. The traditional lecture environment tends to be a difficult way for a lot of students in these categories to process information, and difficult for them or difficult from logistical perspectives. There's a lot of distraction. There's a lot of physical environments to try to navigate. It can be difficult. So varying instructional modes and types and settings can be really beneficial. There's a need for some guidance from faculty with assignments, especially when it comes to group work. Group work can be a major challenge for students in this category. And a lot of that is down to some of those communication and social challenges in some of these categories, and that cyclical and unpredictable nature of impairments. Students can get very anxious and be put in a position where they're having to let classmates down for circumstances beyond their control. But if faculty are able to kind of intervene and guide that process, that can be ameliorated some. And restrictive course policies are another area where students really, really run into issues. Policies that are very restrictive about attendance and absences without any opportunity to negotiate around that, and that are restrictive about technology because uh, things like laptops and smartphones can be implemented in ways that make them assistive technology for many students. But if they don't have access to those things because faculty are worried about distractions, then that becomes something else that's not available for them to support themselves. So, with all of that said, what helps or what would help if it changed? One of the things that students call for the most often when they're asked what would improve their experiences in college is more training for faculty and staff. It's because of how critical those connections are and those people in positions of power and authority over students are. It is really imperative for them to understand the nature of these disabilities and for them to have a certain degree of readiness for dealing with those things, because faculty don't start off knowing everything that they should do to help disabled students either. If they're not in that position, they need support as well to learn more about that. And in general, really, awareness and ways of fighting stigma against many of these conditions that students are facing, especially when it comes to neurodivergence and particularly with psychiatric disabilities. Stigma are really significant issues for students. And uh, if their peers can be reached out to, any of that work, that's also important. Another thing that is really, really valuable to students that comes up over and over again is this sort of informal support from their peers, their friends, other disabled students, non-disabled students, and family. And all of those can also be complicated factors as well, right? The relationships with family are complicated, especially if you are a disabled student with a non-disabled family that you're trying to interact with. Uh, Same goes for peers. There are varying levels of understanding. There's a fear of stigma if they reach out to each other. But if they have access to those supports, they are really, really helpful. So it's important for those to be available. It would also be very helpful, that we've seen a lot of cases, for there to be more and more proactive support around campus. So a lot of the time, the model is really for students to go to the university with diagnosis in hand and get the support that they need back out of it. And that needs the student to already know that they need support. It needs them to, more often than not, already know what support they need. And in a lot of cases, that just is not where they're coming from. So any ways that institutions can really raise students' own awareness of what they might be dealing with, and what is normal to be experiencing in college and what really is an extra challenge that you can and should get more help for, would really help students. And of course, that entails these services being adequately funded and staffed and supported, because I think we're all aware that they just aren't most of the time. That goes for accessibility services. That also goes for counseling services and mental health support services, because that is something that's just necessary for all students across the board, and that a lot of the time they really don't have sufficient access to. Modified physical environments can also be very helpful. Any spaces where sensory input is controlled or controllable, where additional privacy is available, that is a major concern across a number of different conditions. Where students can be free of distractions, that is another significant issue that comes up a lot. Having these spaces where students can have a physical environment that meets their needs are really important, as well as uh, just community for disabled students in a lot of ways. There's also the issue of where disabled identity intersects with other marginalized identities. Obviously, in some ways, this can kind of compound issues, right? There are issues like where what the types of behaviors and needs that might be seen in a positive and sympathetic light in a white student as being part of their disability often get dismissed as behavioral problems or even threatening in a black student just because of racism compounding the problems that ableism creates. On the other hand, though, that's really only half of the story because the more I looked at these issues of intersectional identities, as much as those can create additional problems and like you get things with additional cultural stigma against help seeking, for example, or um, various ways that this might have a negative impact on getting help with a disability. There's also the fact that other communities around other identities can really be a source of support and pride and just that sense of cultural community that can actually really buffer a lot of what disabled students go with. So it, in a lot of ways, having multiple marginalized identities can really have as much of a positive impact on student as it does a negative one, depending on, what their communities are like and how much support they have from family and friends and all the same things. So that can really be a source of support and solace for people. And as I mentioned before, having a sense of disability identity, having self knowledge, and having self advocacy skills are all things that tend to predict student success to a great degree, and that students really call out themselves as having been important to them. There are also things that tend to develop over time. And like I said, they need time to develop. And it might be worth it for institutions to also look into ways that those could be intentionally scaffolded and fostered so that a student who's a freshman who has not had the time to develop a lot of these things yet is getting some support in developing in that direction as well. And finally, sometimes it's just about money. Assistive technology and other supports that students can have available to them can be really, really helpful and beneficial, and they can also cost a lot of money. And sometimes students don't have access to those funds, and sometimes they need something to be able to be successful in college that they're not going to be able to afford on their own. So, I mean, universities are not always full of money either, but it is a site where students could really use additional help and where it would be really great for more support to be available. So, just to wrap up with some concluding thoughts about what we do all about all of this. So, not all of this gets solved right away, right? These are large, complex problems that nobody in higher education is really intentionally creating. It's not necessarily as simple as, just do this tomorrow and everything will be fixed. But there are some things that we know that we can do right now as individuals, as people, which is for faculty and staff, the most important things are really learning more about what students with multiple kinds of needs might need, just getting that information that students so frequently want us to have, and being compassionate, treating students as partners in their education in ways that we're not always prepared to do, that we're not always prepared to relinquish that amount of control to actually speak with the student about what they need and what we could do to be flexible to those needs. For students, learning more is also a great thing to do. Reaching out to peers, whether you yourself are disabled or neurodivergent or not, forming those communities and just being there for people is a really, really valuable thing that really does change experiences for folks. And it is always worth spending some time being reflective and self-examining on what you're experiencing and how you learn and how you learn best and what you struggle with in learning, to kind of identify the places where you might also have some needs or some challenges that you weren't even aware of before. There's a lot of this goes under the radar, and that to the person who has these experiences as well as other people. So checking yourself out is something else that you can do to make sure that everybody gets what they need in the longer term. And speaking of the longer term, some of the things that we might be able to do at the institutional level to change things gradually, advocating for services, for training, and for increased flexibility in how higher education works, working on those more robust and proactive and holistic services and making sure that everyone is trained are great. But also, like, we may, as people in higher education, need to have some longer conversations about how many deadlines do we actually need? Is there another way to do this that isn't as time bound and time constrained? Are there ways that we haven't thought about approaching higher education that would allow for that greater flexibility? We can also work toward fostering physical spaces and communities that would support students who are neurodivergent or disabled, that meet some of those needs in terms of the physical environment. And how do we help create communities for folks to meet others with similar experiences? Things like the neurodivergent interest groups that have formed both at the staff level and the student level are so valuable. It's been so great to see those things developing at Rowan. I honestly think we're ahead of the game in some of those things as these things go. Working to surface hidden ally networks is another thing. And I don't necessarily know what this would look like, but I know that we have these hidden pockets of people who will help you out if you have additional needs. That it's kind of like the opposite of missing stairs. It's extra stairs. So if you run across these people, that's really great, or somebody points you in the right direction. But we might need to think about how we make these things more visible to students, and how we even, I don't want to say formalize, because formalizing isn't always necessarily the best or the right thing, but how do we make those things that students know that they can rely on, and make it less bound to one person who's on a mission, and more, this is something that we all do because it's our responsibility. And for both faculty and students, teaching and learning the skills of metacognition and self-advocacy are really things that could be helpful. Thinking about how we can incorporate those kinds of skills into the curriculum, and how we can help students to explore those further on their own. Because that awareness of self and that ability to negotiate and communicate with other people, they're not skills that people necessarily learn intuitively. And they're things that really help students with these conditions in particular, but all students in the long run. So what else needs to change? And this is the really big picture stuff. This is where we get into way beyond what any one of us can control, but where some of the pain is coming from in our broader environment. And one of them is, hands down, I am with Henry Giroux here. Higher education must be a public good. If higher education is an expectation for everyone to participate in society and have a career, as it is increasingly becoming an economic expectation in that point, then it must likewise be seen as a public good and not something that somebody sinks or swims in on their own. And not a for-profit system where students are sources of revenue instead of people that we are trying to help become fully functioning members of society. If we fix that failure of perception, I think we fix a lot of things that are facing not only disabled and neurodivergent students, but all marginalized students and all students in general. I think another thing that really needs to happen, really two other things that are connected, I don't know why I put them second and fourth here, but this legislation that requires higher education to provide for disabled students needs to be stronger. There needs to be more in the way of requirements and support for making sure that this is clearly a responsibility and clearly an expectation, and one that is supported accordingly. And that includes supporting some form of standardization. There has to be an expectation for what it means for a disabled student to have the same access to higher education as everyone else. And it is not going to mean that everybody necessarily gets exactly the same thing. We are not looking for equality here. We are looking for equity. We are looking for everyone to get to the same goal. So there is some thinking that needs to be done about how we make this less of a confusing maze that students have to kind of fumble through on their own, and more of an expected pattern that students are more able to navigate, and that we are helping them navigate. And finally, I mean, as long as we're going big picture here, but there is a need to resist the carceral and neoliberal attitudes that are are continuing to pervade our social context in general. And higher education is not the source of this problem, but it is a part of this problem. This idea that we treat every student as a potential bad actor and as an adversary the of the faculty member and even of the institution itself. There's a lot of negotiation that needs to be done with these punitive disciplinary attitudes toward education that have been being maintained, and really reckoning with some of the power dynamics involved in that, and some of specifically the racial dimensions that that has had socially. And yeah, similarly, the there's been a lot said, and there could always stand to be more about the impact that, in general, neoliberalism is having on higher education. And it's more than I necessarily have time to get into to any satisfactory degree here, but it is another factor that is really contributing to this situation. And that's something that I've kind of had to reckon with alongside a lot of this. Why is a lot of this bad? Because there's a lot less of they felt need to actually help each other and work for the common good anymore. And maybe it's not anymore. Maybe it's a much longer term problem than that in a lot of ways. But these are the kinds of philosophical things that really need to be overcome before we're going to necessarily be able to completely address all of these issues. So that is pretty much the state of my research as it stands right now. So thank you all very much for coming to this presentation. If you have any follow-up questions after this, or want to discuss or collaborate on anything, I am always up for that. My email is pretty obvious, but there it is. And now I can open the floor for questions, and yeah, just appreciate working with you.
Why don't we go with Aiden first? Do you want to? Are you cool just sort of speaking into the kind of speaking your question, or
Yeah, that's fine by me. Can you hear me?
great? Okay,
Yes.
go ahead.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Ash. It was really cool. One question I had, if you have any, how to propose making education more accessible to people in those demographics you listed without compromising any of the professional like standards and competencies, still preparing them to fulfill whatever job or degree that they're going after.
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, and uh, I'm trying to put my thoughts in order. Sorry about that. But yeah, I think that this is often something that people worry about. In particular, is this idea of rigor, right? The idea that by increasing that flexibility and negotiating the pathways that students take through education more, we will be sacrificing rigor. And I understand that concern because there's, we do want to make sure that the content that is being learned and everything that's being communicated doesn't suffer in any way from that in particular. So what I want to suggest, though, is that a lot of what actually needs to change and shift and become more flexible is not actually the content that's being delivered, but the ways that it's being delivered. So it is more about the fact that the modality can change in a lot of ways, that we can be flexible about things like time and mode and method and things like that, while still dealing with the same amount and the same level of content. So the fact that a certain amount of reading has to get done for the course to get to a certain point, a certain amount of content has to be gotten through in order for the course to get where it's going, right? It does not necessarily have to be in the form of the written word if a student has trouble dealing with that. It doesn't necessarily have to be packaged in the way that it is right now. And there are a lot of different ways that we could sort of deliver that content with a different approach, or in a different setting, or in a different sort of packaging, or allow the student more control over how they actually absorb that content while it remains the same content. And I am not going to pretend that this is a small job, because it isn't. It takes a huge amount of work and effort. And frankly, one of the things that's also important to recognize is that most faculty who aren't necessarily meeting all of these needs aren't doing it because they're cruel and mean and they don't want to. It's really because it becomes an issue of time and constraints. And those become issues because of the lack of time and support that faculty are facing as well. And this goes doubly. Neurodivergent and invisibly disabled people are not just students. They are also faculty. They are also staff and the people who are trying to help them. And our time is being impacted in the same ways. So, the way that burden doesn't fall solely on individual faculty members who are just trying to get through a semester is really something that has to come from institutional level support, and has to be really funded and staffed and formalized, and structures created, institutes created, folks who are there to support you in doing this work. And those are also some of the changes that we really need to see at the institutional level, and that where that material support needs to be coming from, frankly, the state and from all of us, that for it to be able to make that possible. So yeah, it can be done by shifting those modes. It takes a lot of work, and that work is not really being provided for adequately right now. I'm not saying that this is something that anyone should be able to go out and fix tomorrow, because it really isn't. There are broader systemic problems here that are stopping all of this from happening. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Ash. This was really terrific. I really got a lot out of this. As you were discussing some of this stuff, I was thinking about the impact of the pandemic. Obviously devastating in all sorts of ways, especially for vulnerable populations, but also putting people in this weird experience where things that they did normally, they suddenly had to rethink how to do that, because then suddenly become very much more difficult or even impossible at times, right? And it led to a lot of sort of just rethinking practices, so here we are all on Zoom today, and even our regular theorizing talks that are in person now have a Zoom component, right? So the idealistic side of me would hope that experience that people have had would make them more open to thinking about these issues and making adjustments in the way they teach and stuff like that. And I'm just curious, how much have you seen any signs of that? Do you feel like that this experience has made people more open, or is it sort of more the same still? So I'm just sort of curious what you've found has changed or maybe not changed.
That is a great question. And I would say that the impacts there have been a very mixed bag. So I think in some real ways, yes, absolutely, the pandemic has actually represented a breakthrough for accessibility for a lot of folks. That we've suddenly realized that things that we were saying for a long time that we couldn't do, actually, when we had to, we did them because we had to. And you know, this is a great example because I am sitting here doing this presentation virtually because I can't stand up for an hour, and it's not safe for me to be in a room for with a lot of people for an hour. So, you know, I before 2020, this might have been just something that I had to power through. But you know, we have that flexibility and that ability to negotiate now, and that has actually been a really positive development. I think it has really opened things up. I have heard from so many other disabled advocates that they've been able to participate in parts of professionalism and parts of community building that they never would have been able to before because of the shift in modes for the pandemic. At the same time, I think what we see at this moment where we are supposedly moving out of the pandemic is that there's kind of a thoughtless eagerness to go back to normal for its own sake, which whatever normal may mean, but that leaves a lot of disabled folks really feeling left behind. And the same goes for, you know, disabled people are much more likely to be additionally vulnerable to COVID-19. So as you know, the general herd immunity for non-disabled people gets back to a level where people are feeling comfortable being in social situations again, that is creating serious inequities for people who are not able to participate in that yet. And I think in some ways we've also surfaced some real social uglinesses through the pandemic that have a bearing on this discussion and kind of feed into some of those big picture issues I was talking about with, you know, if it comes down to a choice between maybe killing your vulnerable neighbor and not being uncomfortable for half an hour, we found out what some people would choose. And that has laid bare, I think, a lot of things that already existed. But I mean, on the plus side, we're having some of those conversations now. But you know, it has been an interestingly mixed set of experiences that has revealed some opportunities, but that I think a lot of disabled people are now fearing we're going to shut the door on those opportunities too quickly, and you know, with good reason. So,
Thank you so much.
thanks.
Hello. First, Ash, thank you so much. You were so spot on with so much of your insights and your studies and things like that. I have like 3 points that I wanted, or questions or things to discuss, which was number one. I'm in disabled circles a lot. I have disabilities myself, and I have children, 2 children that have Down syndrome that are now young adults. And I talk about this all the time. We're kind of preaching to the choir, right? We've got 29, 25, 30 people on this meeting that are interested in it. And I'm listening to you going, how do we get this? How do we get this recording that we've just made today dispersed to all the faculty members, all the students, so that they can know, one, supports exist, two, some of these things exist, where to try to get help and things like that. How do we stop preaching to the choir amongst ourselves for things like this is like my first part. And you talked about how there's no standardization for support and how it's unevenly implemented. And for those of us in disabled spaces and in a disabled community, we know that like ADA doesn't have enough teeth. Like it's not written with implementation ideology in process. And for those of us dealing with public education systems or IEPs and things like that, even my own accommodations at school, like you said, it's kind of up to faculty whether or not they believe, they implement. You know, I've been being very supported now, but in my undergrad work at Rowan, I had to argue with the teacher and get a dean involved with meeting my accommodations. And so do you have any suggestions, right? Because we talk about we don't need to, I think people think we need to do these little micro steps and these little micro improvements when we could say, hey, how is Rowan going to be like the best at this? How can we like really get the gold star? How can we be welcoming? How can we be more diverse? How can we, let people know these things? So when I'm listening to you and I'm hearing some of the groups that already exist, like I'm a student here and I know about the Success Center, but I don't know about the DEI committee. I don't know, I don't see a lot of things and they're not accessible and the supports are. How do we improve, right? Because for me, it's not about DEI, it's about the A part of accessibility. How do I get that? How do I, and not just me, how do other people know it? How do people get those supports? I'm also the mother of the first female with Down syndrome to graduate from Rowan University in
Awesome.
2020. So, and I think Rowan does a very good job at doing that. I mean, she had Down syndrome and she graduated from college with a bachelor's degree. And that is a remarkable thing because she was the first of like 12 people in the world to have a 4-year degree. And these things aren't accessible, especially when we start talking about those invisible disabilities and cognitive issues, and mental health issues. And, I've had friends in class that have tremendous anxiety, medication, hospitalizations, ER, visits because of heart palpitations. So how do we get this accessibility, improve the accessibility, get the word out more? This is what I'm always having trouble in these spaces that I occupy. It's like, okay, we all know. And how do we expand that? How do we demand it? These are things we need to demand ends to racism. We need to have some action items. So do you have any action items for us? Do you have some tips or some things we could do? And of course, I'm going to email you about research stuff later after this. But thank you. And I applaud you. Awesome.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, congratulations to your daughter. That's so huge and so fantastic. I'm so thrilled to hear that. But yeah, I mean, I think obviously if I had answers to all of those questions, I would be a lot more successful than I am at like everything. But and like a lot of it is just because, these are complicated things. They're complex systems, wheels within wheels, where like what we can do the micro steps. And you know what, it's starfish theory. It's going to help someone. It's every little bit helps. It's still worth doing to do those little things one at a time, because that's what you can do tomorrow instead of saying, okay, we got to work through this for our entire lifetimes probably. And that's what some of the big picture stuff really ends up looking like. But yeah, it is bigger than these groups of people who, as you say, a lot of the time already know that stuff needs to change. And I'm going to give what may end up being a kind of impolitic answer, which is that when I think about this, I think about what works and what has worked. And thinking about, the history that I've been going through of the passage of the ADA, and thinking about what I've seen be successful in terms of student organization on Rowan's campus, where we've seen some really exemplary student leadership in some of these areas. And I think what works is pressure. I think threats of bad press. I think bringing in people who make the money appear, getting attention are really some of the things that actually motivate people to move and really make some of the big systemic changes at the top levels of things. And particularly when it comes to disability, what really stands out for me about the story of the ADA is that what those particular activists did and what was so fascinating and so effective about the passage of that bill is they took advantage of the one thing that makes disability so much different from most other forms of marginalized identity, which is that it can happen to anybody anytime. It doesn't get systemically marginalized into particular communities because it can crop up anywhere. And that means that you can always find a couple of really powerful people who have a disabled sister or a disabled wife or a disabled son. And they went straight for the jugular on that. And that is really the vast majority of what got that bill passed at all in the middle of, for heaven's sake, the Reagan administration. Like, that's a huge accomplishment, and that's how it had to go. Like, yeah, I think to a certain extent, like, we've got to play on self-interest, particularly in a, as I keep saying, a particularly neoliberal social setting, is that you find people where they live and you got to come for them there. So that's what keeps coming to my mind. Another thing that I think is really important is coalition building, like not being splintered. Because the other thing that really helped the ADA pass was all actually no, I'm thinking back to Section 504 in the 70s, where what was happening was you had disabled activists sitting on the steps of the Capitol building, and you had gay rights activists, Black Panthers, and Chicano activists all bringing them lunch. Like, that's how it happens. We don't get split apart from each other. We build community with other people who are also marginalized. And I think that gets particularly hard because that's a wedge that people really like to use against us, is to go, hey, you may be down, but at least you're not those people. And use that as a way to kind of splinter people with less social power. And the more that we're able to resist that, and the more we're able to see our common struggles across each other, and in the fact that there are plenty of people who belong to multiple marginalized identities, I think that is really where we find our power, and we start really being able to resist and demand what should actually have been happening all along. So thank you for a great question. I hope that's of some value, but yeah, I'm pretty much just going off my own pontificating at this point. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I have two more questions. I think we have time for them. We may have to go a little quickly, but we, Andrea, you were sort of there first, and then Janelle has also said in the chat that she has a question. So Andrea first.
Hi, thank you to Ash, and thank you for theorizing a Rowan. Fantastic. Just some comments. One thing that would be really valuable is if all these efforts towards DEI would broaden to also focus on invisible disabilities, because this is not true just of DEI efforts, but in general. I hear, I'm a computer science professor, and it will not surprise anybody, and I don't think I'm, being crazy to say that we have quite a few students, and it's not surprising, with invisible disabilities. We certainly have among our faculty people with invisible disabilities. And sometimes what they report is that, oh, I went to this activity, or I might point out an activity that is going on, and, oh, I went to this activity, but it was all on racial inequities, or it was all on this other thing, and it had nothing to do with the way that I feel invisible. And every time something like that happens, and I'll give you another example. Some dean stands up and says how awful it was during the pandemic, and that we all had to be remote. And for some of my students, the pandemic and remote was amazing. And when they hear how awful it was and how we can't wait to get back to the way it normally was, and it was so great. And yeah, for the neurotypical dean, that was great. But for my students, every time somebody in power says something like that, it kind of rubs salt on the wound of just feeling misunderstood and marginalized. So anyway, so those were two comments, and some specific things that I wanted to suggest that, for people who are more involved and who have more time, or who are more visible in this area, that, when general statements like that are made, maybe we can think about speaking more in a way that is more nuanced. And that say, we are going to try to do X in addition to Y. And doing the and of things brings me to my second suggestion about how faculty with invisible disabilities also need support. And this is something that Ash mentioned. And let me suggest that one form that this additional support could take is providing faculty with concrete examples of, in this situation, here is a sentence that you could say. When you see a student that has this behavior, it may be X, but it could also be Y or Z. And here are some things that you could say. Because, and the reason I say this is because maybe it isn't, maybe this is true of every field, but I certainly come across on a weekly basis faculty who have invisible disabilities and who are not neurotypical. And what might be natural in terms of offering support to a student for, I don't know, let me make a silly example. Let's say a faculty member in psychology who has deep knowledge of these issues, who has studied neurodiversity as a field and has a deep understanding of it. That kind of understanding of what might be happening and what might be helpful might not be so obvious to every faculty member. And sometimes we speak in generalities and we speak in euphemisms. And for some faculty, perhaps more concrete examples and more direct information could be more useful.
Yeah.
And this was my long rant.
No problem. But thank you. Yeah, I think those are really great suggestions. I think Lynn's point is really well taken about needing to really put that A into the DEI. Yeah, because yeah, it is another marginalized identity. And furthermore, like I say, those identities intersect. Like they're if we're already talking about some of those marginalizations, like there are Black autistic people, it is part of both of those conversations to talk about those different forms of marginalization. But,
and the comorbidities of autistic female depressed, right?
Yeah, a lot of it co-occurs, definitely. Yeah, I think one of the groups that I've been really great to see is that neurodiversity, the both allyship and neurodiverse faculty and staff groups, as sort of starting towards some of these support communities, like you're sort of describing. I think that's a great step. I think we could always stand to do more of that. So, yeah, definitely something to keep working on and keep working toward supporting each other in supporting our students.
So just for the sake of time, I want to give Janelle. Can you do it quickly? We're sort of a little bit over. We have a little bit more flexibility with this format. If Ash doesn't mind taking one more question,
I'm good.
But I don't want to overextend you either. You're good with one more?
Yeah.
So Janelle, like, go for it, and then we'll probably conclude things after that.
So I'm a PTL at Rowan, which, in case you don't know, that means I sort of work part-time or, have a little bit more tenuous employment status or certainty of it. But I am neurodivergent, and if you want to add the ASD/depression/anxiety comorbidity, that's me. My younger brother is schizophrenic. He's been diagnosed as such, at least, for the last 40 years. I'm involved with NAMI, which is the National Alliance for Mental Illness. And I was listening to you, and I really appreciate everything you said, and especially the last person who spoke. about faculty support. I would envision that there could be a committee put forth in the university senate or something like that. And I want to mention that I had received a survey, maybe it was in the before times, about whether neurodivergence in the academy. And I was asked if I wanted to be, like anonymously, would you like to be contacted to be on some sort of committee, da, da, da. And I think if we could get, there are certainly people that are professors that are neurodivergent or have invisible disabilities. And connecting those people is really hard because of the stigma.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if somebody couldn't like maybe figure out where that survey came from, if anybody else remembers it. I'll look through my inbox and think about maybe, these things can start with as little as like a conference that, stated to like the humanities departments and everything. It has a lot of, at least, visibility, and then people can make connections there, or as a survey where you have faculty replying and then they say, yes, you may contact me at this email address. And I bet you in the professional staff and in the C-suite staff, there have to be people. Mental illness, psychiatric disabilities, those kinds of things are, I think, just as common as many other issues. And so what we need to do is break down the stigma. And I think we need to do that by having a set of people that kind of know each other across the academy, that, if I know that the librarian that da-da-da-da, then I can reach out to them and I say, I have a special case here, somebody that really needs this kind of help or this kind of support. And if I need to, or and like with the money aspect, I just think if an effort is made, hopefully in the Senate, there could be a committee that could be part professional staff, part faculty, part C-suite, maybe, if we're lucky, and then some student representatives. So that's it.
Yeah, I think that's I think there's some great opportunities there for kind of building that community out more. And I think we're starting to have some really good avenues for that too. That like the Senate's a possibility, but like there's also structures like the Neurodiversity Institute that we may be able to see more, hosting some of this community building and programming between folks at different levels of the university too. So yeah, I think these are ways we can work.
Grant available for faculty for support in how to use the Neurodivergent Institute as a way to springboard to have more accessible classes or something like that, to design a class, then we could like utilize all these bits and bats around the university to actually make, some real tangible progress.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
So I'm gonna there's so much there's a lot of conversation to be had here, and I think this was a great presentation. I'd like to thank everybody very much for the discussion as well. I have, if we had more time, I would probably open up several more cans of worms with moderator's privilege, but I'm not going to do that because we don't have more time. I do want to before I sort of send everyone off and thank Ash one more time, I'd like to just make a couple super quick announcements. One of them is Ash mentioned UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, which is an important, a very important sort of accessibility initiative that we're working on at Rowan. And we are, in fact, there's going to be a UDL festival on Friday, April 21st from 9:30 to 1:30 p.m. In Bozorth Auditorium. It's funded by I think the same Catalyst grant that's helping to fund this talk and some of the other work that we're doing here. So that's something for people to kind of keep an eye out, Rowan Polk in particular. And with all that said, I'd like to then ask everyone to join me one more time in thanking Ash Lierman for this I think really helpful presentation, and I think also for sort of sparking a productive discussion, which I hope everyone will kind of continue to engage in, because I think there's a lot more to be said here. And yeah, I just want to particularly highlight the points about, you know, faculty issues as well as students, and also just thinking about, you know, how much institutional support we need for everybody's kind of time load and workload, because that's a big part of this. I mean, part of why this gets even worse is that we keep ramping these things up, and it makes it even harder for everybody concerned, especially people who are facing challenges. So let's try to think about those structural issues as well. So thank you everyone for this, and like one last time, thank you, Ash.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.